Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Jim Pavlik, and today we're going to be doing a short presentation on implementing and sustaining nicotine-free policies. And here we mean specifically organizational policies. As always, no conflicts of interest to disclose. What we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some of the, I want to frame this around guiding principles. We've identified 5 ways of making your decisions, 5 things that you want to consider as you make the choices that you make when you're designing your policies, so that the policies stick around for the long term. We want to discuss what those components are, those things that we're going to be asking you to make decisions about. What are the evidence-based best practices and what do they suggest? And then finally, we're going to provide just a couple resources, although just to say, like, the main resource that we're going to be providing or talking about is the toolkit that we've talked about before that's on this issue. That toolkit actually has quite a bit of tools inside. So with that out of the way, these are those guiding principles. I thought I played around with the idea of making them all C's. I think there's a way to do that, just to stick with like cutesy acronyms. But to be honest, this is a lot more straightforward, a lot cleaner. As we discuss the sort of 10 things that you need to be thinking about as you design your policy, think about how they activate one or more of the 5 things on this slide. And so I'm going to, in an effort to prevent myself from repeating myself throughout the presentation today, I just want to kind of put these aside and just have you hold them in your mind as we go through. The first thing to think about is consistency. And consistency presents itself at the beginning of this process in the sense that if you're in community mental health, if you're in community behavioral health, if you're in substance abuse recovery, and you're allowing your client base to use tobacco, there's an inconsistency in your mission to provide care and support and helping manage and maintain and stabilize emotional factors and those sorts of things. And so going nicotine-free is a way of creating a consistency between the overall mission of the organization and our feelings, our emotions, or our thoughts about tobacco. It shows up again at the end of this process. When we talk about enforcement, we're going to be really talking about consistency and making sure that enforcement is consistent across sites and across client types, and making sure it's consistent between staff and clients. And we're just going to talk about consistency over and over and over again. And then as we're designing the policy, we're also going to make sure that there's a sort of internal consistency within the policy itself. And this going around clockwise, transparency is another one of these things that really starts in the beginning of the process, and then we really treat it as a virtue. That's something that we really signal that we're being really transparent throughout the entire design and execution phase, which is to say, we never want to hide that we're doing this. We don't want to cloister the wellness committee off in some dark room to write the policy in secret and then just surprise everybody 6 months later with a fully formed policy. And the other side of this is, again, at the end, when your organization has gone tobacco-free, we want you to be bragging about it. We want you to be making that a part of the marketing materials that you send out. In my experience, a lot of substance abuse facilities in particular have a tendency to go tobacco-free, but then to kind of treat it like they're ashamed of it. They'll put it as a footnote, like in the back of their website. One of the things I've seen people do is they don't ever actually say they're tobacco-free, but then they will list for incoming clients on their website a list of contraband, and on the list of contraband, they'll just include tobacco products. What ends up happening there is a lot of people end up showing up at the facility and then they're surprised and potentially angered. There's always a worry that going tobacco-free is going to hurt the census. Right? You're going to get fewer clients. This is not a thing that actually happens. There's a trade-off. That keeps censuses right about equal before and after this, the intervention takes place. And we see that over and over and over again across applications. So we just need to make sure that if we do go tobacco-free, that we get those clients that value that, right? And they're out there. We just need to make sure that they understand that that's the service that we're providing. aligned with transparency and making sure that everybody is aware of what you're doing, we also want this process to be bi-directional. We want to be making announcements about what we're doing, about the policy that is going to take place. Here is who's going to be impacted and how, etc. But then also actively soliciting feedback from the people that are going to be impacted by the policy, making sure that we hear their complaints, their worries, their concerns, and that we're being responsive to those. And we want to elevate bidirectionality, not just as we don't want to treat it just as a way that we're doing this, but we want to really promote out that we're seeking that bidirectionality. We want to treat bidirectionality itself as a value. Then celebration, and I'm going to talk about celebration throughout, but this kind of goes along with that transparency, making sure that we're bragging about the nicotine-free policy on the websites and that kind of thing. We kind of want to celebrate all the way through this process. This really is the best decision for your clients. This is a really good decision for your staff. We don't want to be ashamed about anything, and we want to celebrate the decision to do it, and we want to celebrate the hard work that goes into designing, executing, and enforcing this policy. And then finally, competency. And this shows up in a lot of different areas. We're going to hit it pretty hard on the communications aspect of today's talk. But really what we need to do, people don't like to change. There's a built-in human status quo bias. Nobody likes to become anything. They like to arrive on the other side and they like to have been guided successfully. And right at the very beginning, you really need to stand up and say, I'm going to sail this ship. I have all the skills I need. I have all the knowledge I need. Are we together? You want to include the entire wellness committee in this. You want to impress upon people that you can get them through this otherwise hard change. And if they believe that, they're far more likely to go along with whatever the policy is. So one other thing, and this is an important beginning of when we talk about the sustainability elements, and I'll return to that topic in just a second. There is an ROI, a return on investment. But the thing I want to stress here is that there is an investment. So that's the first side. I want to stress that you have to get a return on your investment. You have to understand there is going to be a time and money cost initially. Nothing's free, even if it's just time, even if it's just establishing the wellness committee and regular weekly meetings or even monthly or quarterly meetings with that staff. Somebody has to dedicate some part of their day to do this. But on the flip side, there is a return. Staff smoking tends to go down roughly on the order of about 5% of staff, depending on the size of your organization. You get more quit attempts, lower maintenance fees, maybe an insurance liability discount. All kinds of things can come into this. So which is to say that the second thing I'd like to emphasize on this slide is, unless you're measuring the right things, you probably won't even see that you got that return, but we see it over and over and over again in the literature. We know that it happens. It takes a little while, sometimes on average of 4 or 5 years, to see that return really come to fruition. But the other side of this is, without really dedicating resources to figuring out if you get a return on your investment, you probably won't actually see it. It takes long enough and slow enough that without hiring an economist, it's very hard to detect it in a single agency. Which is to say, if you hire an economist, that's going to eat into how quickly you get that return back. My argument here is always just trust that you're going to benefit from it and track what you can to see it. And some of those things are things like how many sick days are being used and how many of your patients are seeking medical care for chronic conditions that are now going to be improving as time goes on, that kind of thing. And then one final real preliminary note before we really dig into the topic at hand, and that is, the reason that tobacco-free policies work and the reason that we see a return on investment is because it does that third thing, the thing that's highlighted there. It reshapes the environment. It makes the healthy choice the default. It makes the healthy choice the easy thing to do. It's the thing that we're always saying that we need to do in the sort of public health world is to make the easy choices, or to make the healthy choices the easy choices. Well, reshaping the environment and going tobacco-free, going nicotine-free, it does do that. Okay, so as we begin, I've already talked about this idea of consistency and bringing consistency over and over and over again. A tobacco-free policy is a great way to act as a bridge between various components of any kind of organization, but especially organizations that are in the mental or medical health world. as I've already mentioned, tobacco smoking, of course, is harmful, and it makes moods unstable, and it can prolong the recovery efforts. And so we want to make sure that we're really um, looking for these opportunities where we can align processes, where the mission and values of the organization can be promoted, so that we're once we start working in tobacco, we start to really see that we're all working in the same direction. And so this is where we see, like, we want you to be looking at your mission and value statements and seeing how tobacco use or the prohibition of use on campus or on site contradicts or furthers your messaging there, which is to say, you have a mission to care. I don't know exactly how you word that on your websites or in your internal documents, but do look at that mission and then ask yourself if allowing tobacco use contradicts that mission. And then you start, and if it, and it most certainly does, right? And so then how does going to nicotine-free promote that mission? And so always getting to try to, we want to not just reignite the organizational mission, but understand that our employees also have a mission to care, a personal mission that brought them into this field. And by using mission and values-based language, aligning not just the organization across departments, but realigning our employees and our staff's mission with the organization that they work for. I've already mentioned this. We do most of the material today is going to be coming from this toolkit. It is available for free, downloadable on our website. Got a lot of great thought exercises and strategies and tools. Highly recommend this toolkit, regardless of where you are in this process. If you've never even thought about it before and you're just starting to like dip your toes in, you want to know more, great guide. If you're already tobacco free and you're just looking for ways to like strengthen your rhetorical approach or your communication strategy, it's also a good guide for that too. The rest of the presentation after this slide is going to be using these icons. So this is what they all mean. I'll be using my words to talk about them again. But these are the 10 things that are the 10 things you need to consider and make decisions about as you're designing and executing your plan. We're only going to be talking about these 9 today, and I'm going to begin with the Wellness Committee. And those of you for whom this is not your first webinar in this community of practice, you have seen me, I think, in 2 or 3 other presentations talk about the importance of the Wellness Committee. This is one of 3 things that really just shows up in the literature over and over and over again. If we look at tobacco-free policies, nicotine-free policies that have been sustained, one of the things they all share in common is having a wellness committee, and bearing in mind, not necessarily a tobacco-free committee, but we want to envelop tobacco-free processes inside of a larger wellness, under a larger wellness umbrella. And similarly, if we look at those policies that were executed and then were rolled back, one of the things they all seem to share is a lack of a wellness committee. So really from both angles, we just know that this is hard work. It requires creativity and dedication. It requires a sort of a constantly evolving pool of champions to really make sure that that we can get the ball rolling and keep it rolling. And that passion is housed within the wellness committee. And a well-designed wellness committee is going to have a variety of interests on it. And that point is going to show up again when we get to communications. And it's also embedded inside that idea of bidirectionality. The more people we have expressing their concerns, providing their expertise, the better our policy is going to be, the more responsive our policy is going to be, the stronger our commitment to this policy is going to be, and the stronger our commitment to this policy is, the more likely it will last. We list here some of the ideas of people you might want to have on a wellness committee. I mean, obviously, how many people sit around that table is dependent on a lot of things, including your staff capacity and the size of your organization and those things. But one area that I always like to focus on is getting opponents onto the committee if you can. And because a lot of the opposition to a tobacco-free or nicotine-free policy comes from a really good place. People are concerned about the census. They want to keep the lights on, and they know that the organization needs to make money. People are concerned that it's going to aggravate psychotic conditions or emotional conditions. It's going to cause agitation or stress. And so it comes from a place of caring about the clients themselves. And we need to make sure that they understand that their voices are being heard, and not in a sort of tokenized way, but really given a central role in helping us make sure that our policy is responsive to the needs. And even if that just means acknowledging that those concerns exist, even if they're not quote unquote real, right? Like, we know that in fact, people who quit smoking, their agitation goes down, their stress goes down, their mood stabilizes, right? So concerns that it's going to be the opposite are unfounded, but we still need to provide an outlet for those opinions to be heard and then responded to. This is another area, and those of you, again, who've heard me or Chad talk in the past know that we're big proponents of using peers whenever possible. And championing nicotine-free policies is a wonderful role for peers. The very most convincing people to answer the question, should this organization go tobacco-free, are your clients who have gone tobacco-free and seen their lives improve. And elevating their voices and getting them in front of the wellness committee and getting them in front of the senior leadership, this can be a real persuasive move. And this is when we talk about a sort of a constant churning. We need these passionate champions to really, scream our praises down the hallways. Peers are great for that. Because first of all, they've lived it, so they're very dedicated, passionate speakers for it. But also because we have a lot more of them than we do staff. Right, and there's a little bit more churn, a little bit more turnover in our peer and client bases, and so there's always new blood to bring that passion back up and keep it at peak levels. So moving on, we want to create a change plan. I said there were 3 things that really show up in the literature over and over and over again. When you have them, you're more likely to be sustainable. And if you don't have them, you're less likely to be sustainable. And this is the other one, is really spending the time to plan what you're going to do. And these things here, 1 through 3, are all tools that are there, and they're good exercises. These are things that exist inside the toolkit. But then identifying human capital in your budget. I've already been talking about that with the idea of champions and who's going to be on your wellness committee, and the idea that there is an investment that has to be made to see a return on investment. So I'm not going to go into this too deeply, other than to say, go to the toolkit, do spend the time to plan. How long it takes you to design a good plan and roll it out and really begin the enforcement and evaluation phases at the end is sort of dependent on where you are now and your commitment to it, your organization's commitment to it, what supports are already in place, et cetera. But in general, probably about 6 to 9 months of planning. And then, so if you think about a 3-month evaluation period, you'd be done with your evaluation from start to finish at either the 9th month, conclusion of the 9th or 12th month, give or take. So 6 to 9 months to really design and roll out a policy. Communication is one of those things that really takes place throughout the entire design process. You want to announce at the beginning that the wellness committee is forming and what their goals are. You want to be announcing things like where you're getting your information and your input and your advice. You want to be making sure that you set up at the very beginning that bidirectionality piece and saying, this is how you can get information to us. Here's when we're going to be meeting publicly. Here's where we're going to put a box in the hallway where you can write down your concerns on 3x5 note cards, and we'll read them every week. Then you want to put the responses to those, that type of concern expression, maybe in a weekly or monthly staff newsletter, maybe on a bulletin board. It kind of depends on the communications infrastructure that you already have in place. But it really, you want to make sure that you have sort of already at the beginning said, okay, this process is going to take us, we're going to do this in 7 months. So we're going to have 7 monthly newsletter opportunities. We're going to have a couple bi-weekly texts or tweets, or we're going to have 1 all-staff meeting in this mix. So like, how do we make sure that we're promoting this tobacco-free policy throughout each of these opportunities? And we'll really time those out, plan those out. What's your verbiage going to look like? How can you reactivate the mission values inside of the words that you're using? And then, as I've said multiple times, getting a lot of people around the committee meetings, and then also that we get even more from the rest of the staff and client base. And again, making sure that you do engage clients and engage your neighbors, your physical neighbors in space. That is, if you're going tobacco free for the first time, you may suddenly have you just push smoking to the edges of the property. Maybe that's pushing into a residence or next to a nearby business. And you want to make sure that you're communicating out to them as well. And so in the toolkit, you'll see some instruction around what we call a good neighbor policy. And one of the things I always stress here is that a lot of times there isn't a lot that you can do, but making sure that you're opening up avenues to hear from your neighbors is enough to tamp down resistance to the development of your policy. But to the extent that you're working with other commercial or industrial neighbors, other places that have to clean their parking lots or otherwise manage their spaces, they might join you in this endeavor, and you can sort of expand the domain, the jurisdiction of your policy by virtue of working with a nearby business that also decides to ramp up their enforcement as well. So we're handling this education and support at the same time. Typically, these are, when we think of the nicotine-free policy, what we're mostly talking about is that literal document that you write up that says, these are the tobacco products that are prohibited. These are the sites, the structures, the automobiles where it's prohibited, and these are the staff and clients that are affected by this policy. And as I'll say over and over and over again, if you let me, the bigger and broader the policy it is, the actual easier it is to enforce. And that sounds really weird to think that like enforcing it across more space should make it, it's not intuitive that should make it easier to include all staff rather than some staff. Why would that make it easier? And the bottom line is that the more broad the policy is, the more people it covers, the more time it covers, et cetera, the simpler your language around who's impacted and when and where becomes. So you can just say all products all the time, everywhere, to everybody, and that's just the easiest thing to understand. And it's also the most philosophically or ideologically consistent way to talk about this issue. So we're handling cessation support and education together because we want these are supportive policies. The bottom line is that the people who are going to be most negatively impacted by the policy are your smoking clients and your smoking staff. And more generally, your tobacco using clients and your tobacco using staff, right? And so the fewer of them there are, then the less resistance you're going to face to the policy. So we want to try, although the policy itself is not a ban, right? We're not saying you have to give up smoking or that you have to give up nicotine altogether. What we're saying is you can't do it here. You can't do it on site. You can't do it during your work shift. You can't do it when you're coming in for treatment or whatever it is. And so then, but we still, to the extent that we can, we do want to encourage quit attempts, right? I mean, that's sort of ideal. And both from a provision of healthcare perspective, people are just going to be healthier if they give up smoking or tobacco use, but also then from a supporting the policy standpoint. And so in those cases, education is really important, right? Education is a necessary but insufficient way of getting a quit attempt. It also helps explain why we're doing this. It's all part of our communication strategy and our larger mission to care. But then we also want to provide support for either the quit attempt or the smoke-free shift, the tobacco-free shift, which is to say, it's pretty common that we don't make our staff quit drinking necessarily. That's a legal activity that if somebody wants to do it, they certainly have a legal freedom to do that. But we don't let them drink during their work shift. We all sort of just intuit that our work shifts are liquor free. Similarly, we want to promote a smoke-free shift. And that may mean providing our staff with gum, patch, or lozenge to help them get through the day. And that's also true of visitors. It might, if you're running inpatient support groups, you might be patching people or providing them gum to make sure that they can get through those services on site without having to run out to the parking lot and smoke a cigarette. When we educate our staff, we're also thinking about making them really efficient and effective providers of tobacco cessation services. We're not making people quit smoking, and so it's going to be the case that in order to provide top quality care, somebody who smokes may have to counsel somebody else on how to quit. And when we survey individuals, we know that they balk against that. Nobody wants to be a hypocrite. Nobody wants to be in a position of do what I say and not what I do. But it's just unfortunately the case that none of us are perfect. None of us lead perfectly emotionally sound lives. None of us are raising perfect children. None of us are excelling at every aspect of our workplace. And yet we're still in a position as counselors and therapists to basically be helping people find the good advice that they can get, right? And some of that good advice is going to come from us, especially when it comes to things like quitting smoking. And we need to be giving that advice, even if we are in fact smokers ourselves. So another area where people end up not wanting to provide these services is when they're afraid that they're going to provide them improperly and perhaps and potentially give a harm. And nobody wants to be in a position where they might harm their clients. And so, and both of those two aspects, providing good education to our staff about what they're supposed to be doing, how they're supposed to be doing it, how they're going to be audited or supervised, these are critical. And once we do this education piece, if it really is a skills transfer of some kind, we really see resistance to the policy really drop down pretty significantly. And that includes, by the way, like, so we always sort of rush to like, well, how do I provide the counseling, or how do I run a group? It can actually be as easy as, have they practiced making referrals? Who do they make referrals to? How do they connect people to services? And I think when I did the low burden strategies I think 2 months ago now, I mentioned studies where all you have to do is give people a tobacco cessation service that they can send their clients to, and suddenly screening goes right up to maximum, basically. So before there was a referral service in place, you might only screen 60% of your clients, because what's the point of asking if people smoke or not if you don't help them quit? But as soon as you say, like, no, we have a partner out in the community who's handling groups, or who's doing this thing with the quit line, or they're handing out pharmacotherapy, and all you have to do is get the client to that person, suddenly we screen more and we refer more both. We have talked a lot about the 5 A's. And so part of a supportive infrastructure for your tobacco-free or your nicotine-free organizational policy is providing evidence-based services inside. And now we're aligning our nicotine-free policy with our service provision. That's essentially what this is. And to always remember that providing, or at least recommending, pharmacotherapy is really just the nicotine version of medication-assisted treatment. So if you already have medication-assisted treatment protocols, and I believe everybody on the line does, just align your tobacco policies with those same protocols. When I normally give this talk, I always have to take a moment to say, drafting the policy is where everybody's mind, when I say, like, we're going to talk about policies, nicotine-free policies, people think about two things: enforcement first, who's going to enforce it and what are they going to enforce and what's it going to look like and how many chairs are going to get thrown through windows. The answer is none, don't worry. The other thing they think about is this part, drafting the policy. And I always rush to say, this is really the easiest part. You can just Google online tobacco-free policies, smoke-free campuses, and here's a little Google trick. If you type in the word file type, one word, :PDF, you can just get policies as they exist in other places. And you can just steal those and then change XYZ core to the name of your organization and just run with that. Now, I'm not saying be that thoughtless or unintentional with it, but it really can be that easy. From place to place, the effect of these policies is going to be, the goal of these policies, the effects of these policies are going to be very similar. I would encourage you to try to change the language so that it reflects language that you're already using, and making sure that it covers these things. Not every policy that you're going to snag online in this sort of haphazard way I just recommended is going to be as comprehensive as the one I'm proposing. It's not going to be as complete as the one I'm proposing. So, make the adaptations that you need. But the nice thing about getting model policies that are already sort of out there in the world is you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to overthink a lot of the stuff that's really kind of straightforward. In the toolkit that I keep mentioning, we have one example of a model policy. Ours is pretty complete. And it's also, but at the same time, it doesn't run to 8 or 9 pages. I've seen some tobacco-free policies that do. Um, that seems like a little bit of overkill to me, but to each their own. Point being, drafting the policy is really easy. It's really convincing people this is the best thing. That's really hard, and then making sure that we support it along the way. Those are the two things that actually take the most time. I do want to specifically call out that if you do go, especially if you do go out and just sort of snag policies off the internet, to make sure that they are covering electronic nicotine devices, ends, e-cigarettes, hookahs, Juul, whatever. A lot of policies that are currently out in the world and being enforced were written, before the real Juul explosion of 2017. And sometimes even before the introduction of e-cigs back in 2011, 2012. So we encourage you to go ahead and prohibit these items too, again, from a sort of a consistent enforcement practice. It's just very hard to square saying, well, nicotine is bad and an addiction is an addiction is an addiction, and all this alignment language that we would normally want to see, and then saying, but there's a big electronic exclusion. It's hard to support philosophically, and that kind of friction between what your policy is doing and the way that you sort of build in these carve-outs become grab points for the resistant, basically, to say, like, well, are we really doing it in the best interest of the clients if we do this carve-out or whatever? It allows the whole policy sort of to be questioned. So we do recommend making sure you add some language like what you see here, and then you might add the caveat, or you might, I'm sorry, not the caveat, but you might actually sort of list some of the products, say like e-cigarettes, vape pens, Juuls, and then make sure that it does say something like etc., or this list is not to be considered complete or something like that, because new things come online all the time, and you don't want to be necessarily rewriting your policy every single time nicotine salt pods get introduced, or IQOS gets introduced, or another heat not burn product comes on the market. You want to make sure that you just sort of say, like, any recreational or non-medicinal use of nicotine is prohibited on site. And you might, depending on your site, you also might need to say something like that too, that makes it clear that things like gum patch lozenge, nicotine replacement therapy aren't being prohibited by your policy, right? It's just really the recreational use that's problematic. Launching your policy really needs to be its own event, and it should be something that is celebrated. So one thing that we always recommend is doing a practice day, and the practice day would normally be done maybe 1 or 2 months or so. So maybe it's 6 weeks in advance of your actual launch day. And that's twofold. One is that it helps you iron out the sort of logistical difficulties. If you have decided, for example, to go with tobacco-free shifts, you might be patching people. Well, who has the power to unlock the cabinet where those patches are being stored? Who has the authority to hand them out, and to whom? Is there a sign-in sheet? Is it, or, how are you tracking this? Are you tracking it? And maybe you failed to really iron out that process until the day of, and then nobody knew who to ask, who to send people to when they were asked, or where the patches were. You got to iron that kind of stuff out. But the more important thing that happens on a practice day is that nobody's scared of a practice day. We're all just going to go tobacco-free. This is what a practice day is. We're just going to go tobacco-free that day. Just one day. Let's just make it a Tuesday. And what will happen at the end of the day is that the building will not be burned down. The hallways will not erupt into mass violence. The sheriff's office will not have to be called every 25 minutes to resolve some problem, right? When the day goes smoothly, or more or less smoothly, minus some operational or logistical challenges, then when it comes to the real launch day, people are a lot less nervous about what it's going to look like. That's the bottom line. And if there are problems, it was just a practice day, and now we know how to respond to them. Now we know who to go to. Now we know what the protocols look like, that kind of thing. We do want to make sure that especially if you're dealing in an outpatient situation, you have a lot of visitors or family, friends coming on site, people you don't see really regularly. Maybe you have some clients that are only in the office every 2 or 3 months, that kind of thing. You want to be making a lot of reminders, putting up posters down the hallway so that everybody, or as many people as possible, are aware of the policy change and the day that it's taking place. You don't want to enforce. I'm going to tell you in a minute that enforcement is always easier than you think it's going to be, but that it's not going to happen on its own. This is you don't want to be telling 50 people in the first hour that you're smoke free now or tobacco free now. Maybe it's only 1 or 2 people. You want to keep that down to a minimum. And so we want to make sure we're sending out our pre-launch reminders. And then I think the most important thing on this slide, since I actually wrote this on a different slide, it's so important, is really you want to celebrate this day. This should not be a day of dread. We shouldn't be approaching it nervous and scared. We really are aligning our mission or aligning our values. We're about to really come up and we're really going to come up in the world of providing the top quality care. We really need to celebrate that the policy is happening, and we want to celebrate those people who helped us do this, right? The people on the wellness committee, but also all the people in the hallways that helped us improve the policy by giving us their concerns through that bidirectional process that we established. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on enforcement. This is where everybody's brain goes when we decide we're going to talk about policies. If you've had a policy before, one of the places and you don't have it anymore, it's probably because of inadequate enforcement. And so what you ended up with is a policy in name only. It existed, but nobody was following it. And so eventually you really didn't have a policy anymore. The 2 things to know about enforcement is it's never as bad as you think it's going to be. And the other thing to know is that as bad as it is, it gets better as time goes on, provided that you continue to enforce it. As I said when I gave this talk most recently, the culture eventually does the most work for you, right? When airlines first went tobacco free, when restaurants first went tobacco free, when hospitals first went tobacco free, yeah, there was some friction. There are people who were upset, but now nobody thinks about it. We just know that you don't smoke on airplanes for the most part, right? We just know that, of course, you don't smoke in hospitals. Doctors can't, in good conscience, let you smoke, and so people get it. Even in the mental health, behavioral health, substance abuse worlds, like people understand, even if they don't like it. And so when you do try to enforce the policy, if you do walk up to people, and we recommend doing so in a positive and educational light, treating the active enforcement as an intervention and not a conflict, right? You go up to people and you're like, hey, I wasn't sure if you knew, but this is a tobacco-free policy, right? Then normally the response is, oh, okay. Right? And some of them knew that in advance, and they were just hoping to get away with it, hoping that people's general basic shyness, their lack of wanting conflict will just protect them. And you don't have to be like super overbearing or physically aggressive or even scowl-faced to just say like, oh, hey, I noticed, and I wasn't sure if you were aware, but you can't smoke here, right? Like that, it can just be that simple. And there are other ways, more creative ways that you can engage. But generally speaking, most people just nod and go, okay. It's not always the case. I don't want to promise rainbows and unicorns. But generally speaking, while there may be some conflict along the way, it's not with absolutely everybody. And then once you really establish the norm that you can't smoke here, and there are so very, very few people visibly smoking or using nicotine on site, and the norm of everybody's going to be enforcing this all the time, you really do diminish this to a controllable level. And as it diminishes in visibility, you also get a diminishment of the actual friction. I always put this as the top bullet point on this slide. Develop your own script. Everybody asks people like me for us to give them scripts. And it's not generally worth it because for the script itself actually vanishes pretty quickly, which is to say you can come up with all these scenario plannings, and we do recommend a scenario planning exercise where you say like, okay, well, how would you approach a smoking client? How would you approach a smoking visitor? How would you, a contractor, et cetera, et cetera. You just kind of write these things down. Then you develop sort of pat language that reflects the mission and values of your organization. Maybe it's reflective of language in the policy itself. But then what you need to do to really make the script exercise valuable is role play. Practice using that script. Practice, 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 practice. Do an all-day workshop with key staff, or if you see a certain team not enforcing the strategy, pull them aside for an extra workshop, whatever it takes, and then have them practice the scripts until they're literally memorized and they start ad-libbing. Get to the point where they actually put the words in the document into their own words. The only words that anybody's ever going to be comfortable saying to people in this sort of fraught environment where they don't really want to be anyway is if it's the words they believe in. And I mean expressing values that they believe in, really buying into the policy and how it is, this really is caring for people. And then also making sure as part of the script development that you, not only do you engage positively, which is what I've already said, but also always cage not using tobacco on site in terms of what it means for other people, right? Using nicotine, being seen using nicotine, these can trigger people, right? It can make, which it can be uncomfortable. If somebody else were to then engage in that, it's going to be unhealthy, right? And so especially this is true with like say visitors, family and friends. And you say like, hey, like I understand you're here. I know this is really frustrating for you. I know that this is, an emotionally vulnerable time, but because we were caring for so many people, we really can't have you smoking on campus. And when they're there to visit somebody who's receiving services, they're going to be pretty sympathetic to that. And again, I don't want to overpromise this kind of thing, but generally speaking, people understand. This is a caregiving space. We can't be engaging in unhealthy activities. When we say enlisting outside support, this means to the extent that you have a cleaning crew, or maybe your property is patrolled by either a private security operation, or maybe you have frequent law enforcement organizations that come by in a good way. I mean, like they're patrolling to make sure everything's okay. Trying to enlist their support as long as you can trust that support is going to be provided in the positive and therapeutic way that you would do it yourself. The bottom 2 points are actually going to take up the remaining parts of the slides in this enforcement section, but consistent, continuous enforcement. The more you enforce at the beginning and making sure that everybody always knows, and that you're enforcing it equally across staff and clients and across different types of clients, maybe receiving different services, that kind of thing, over time, the less you'll have to continue to always be enforcing. Once you establish the norm, that does most of the work for you. I shoved this into the enforcement section just because this is when you do what's called incremental change, and I'll describe that in just a second. Where it shows up is an inability to enforce consistently and continuously. So that's why I have it in this enforcement section. So one of the key things that happens all the time is somebody will say like, well, we have 3 different sites, or we have inpatient and outpatient services, and we have the acute distress clinic, the emergency walk-in clinic, and those all operate differently. They have different client bases, they have different staff, and we're going to do one of these sites and not the other 2, or these 2 and not that one, or we're going to bring that other client or that other space on into the policy 6 months from now. We want to make sure that we have it practiced over here where we think it's going to be easier, and then we'll take what we learn to that other site. Well, that alone actually makes the policy so much more difficult to enforce consistently and easily, that it often never happens. The other site will just, the deadline for getting them on board will just keep getting further and further and further pushed out. And in the time that it takes to finally pull that other site in, the policy is itself collapsing. And to the extent that you're like, well, we want to learn how to do it over here, and then we'll take that over there, because the actual incremental change changes the way that you would enforce, you're actually not creating transferable skills. The skills you're learning are specifically on how to enforce a transitional policy that you won't actually have. So the literature frowns on this, and in my experience, the literature is correct to do so. This just becomes really, really difficult, and organizations that try it fail more often than they succeed altogether. And so it's very possible that if you are at an organization that used to have a tobacco-free policy and doesn't anymore, the chances that your organization tried a transitional policy and then gave up on the whole thing are pretty high. So try not to do that. I'm going to say it on this slide. I've already said it before. I'm saying it on this slide. I'm going to say it on the next slide. You have to be consistent, right? We started this presentation with saying agency alignment and alignment with mission and alignment with values and alignment with the medication-assisted treatment protocols. we want to tell one story with our nicotine-free policy. And so we want to make sure that we have a clear process and that we abide by it. Right. And then I've already talked about this sort of transitional phase approach that people want to do. The sort of value, the underlying value that betrays is this consistency. One of the things that happens here is if clients are allowed to smoke over there at that facility, if they're receiving, say, outpatient treatment services, but now they're over here in inpatient, they may change how they report what they're dealing with so that they can move, right? So they're not, at that point, they're so being persuaded by their addiction to nicotine that they're actually undermining their own care in order to gain access to the nicotine, right? But if over there is not an option, then you eliminate that. One of the things, and I repeat this fact over and over and over again because it's just so amazing to me, is in psychiatric type facilities where smoking is still allowed, violence between clients and violence between clients and staff show up most frequently just before and just after timed smoke breaks, right? We forget because we're so inculcated into a smoking culture that we often don't really think about what it means to say that nicotine is a psychoactive drug, that, you know, it causes stimulation. And also we sort of downplay how addicted people are and how physically dependent they are. And that when they're in withdrawal, they're moody and quick to agitate. And so right before smoke breaks, when they're in withdrawal, that's a key moment for violence. And especially when they're seeing somebody outside smoking, they're getting triggered and they're like, why him and not me? Why is he out there and not me? And then also right after smoke breaks, when you think that this sort of calmative effect of smoking that is being pursued in the midst of withdrawal, you think that maybe that would help, but in fact, it's the opposite. The stimulating effects of nicotine can also like trigger aggression. So there's a couple different ways that we want to think about the value of being consistent. And so when we see that when organizations have tried incremental change, 90% of absolute bans were still in effect 6 months after they were implemented, but only 75% of ones that had tried transitional phases. So it's not a death knell if you think that you're going to try a transitional phase. What I would say is, and this speaks to this competency thing that I signaled at the very beginning, set your deadlines, hit your deadlines. Once you start pushing deadlines forward, then that's sort of seen as a crack in the facade. It gives onlookers reason to doubt the efficacy of the leadership that's in charge. And those who are actively resistant to the policy will look at a postponed deadline as a victory and a reason to double down on their resistance, because maybe they can crack the entire policy. So really do say, like, if we're going to get the walk-in clinic on board 12 months after the inpatient ward goes tobacco-free, then you need to hit that 12-month deadline. And that's part of signaling your competency and your commitment. And then finally, and really there's not a lot to say here because every plan is going to look a little different and the key measurables are going to differ from site to site, but you do need to evaluate your program. You do need to set, like, what are your goals? Are you hoping to get quit attempts out of this? Are you just hoping to see reductions in the use of isolation or restraint? Are you hoping to reduce your insurance liability? Are you hoping to see better long-term recovery abstinence rates? And make sure that you set those targets at the beginning. And you'll want to talk about that, what these evaluations and benchmark strategies are going to be for you with the wellness committee. They're all going to have different ideas about what they're hoping to get and see. So you want to start this process really early. And you want that is the picking of your targets, that's your measurables. And then once you launch the policy, you need to start collecting those. And one of the things I always point out here is there are some things that just, how do I say this, where what you're trying to do is see something go away, right? Like it's much easier to see things that happen due to the policy and not see things that are no longer happening because of the policy. And isolation and restraint as strategies for those who get into agitated states is a good example of that. If you are having, say, 13 uses of isolation or restraint in a month, and then suddenly you went down to 6, every one of those instances can be really stressful and is noticeable, right? The actual presence of the agitated state is a visible thing that people can glom onto. And in fact, when we interview or survey uh, staff before and after a policy, how many incidences of X, Y, and Z, and were those related to the policy or not? The smoking staff are more likely to see every instance of isolation or restraint as being rooted in the existence of the policy, and non-smoking staff are less likely to see it that way. So what we want to do is, well before we start measuring our policy, is count things like that, right? Because what we're hoping to see is that those things go down. Which is to say, we're looking for a lack of something. And when we're trying to track a lack of something, it's just really hard to do post. You really need to say that in advance and start measuring in advance so that you can see that decline. It's similarly with sick days. You only notice when somebody's not in the office. You don't notice when they're there because the default is they're there. So you might want to work with HR to see if there are fewer sick days pre and post your policy. That's something you'd want to do. You'd want to name that earlier in the process. We do want you to come up with a continuous quality improvement process so that you're making sure that you give yourself the time you need to succeed, the time you need to actually hit your benchmarks before you start readjusting your policies. And that is going to conclude my comments. So at this point, I'll just open it up. If you have questions or concerns, comments about any of this, you can either chat them into me, you can use the Q&A, or if you want to signal to me that you just want me to unmute your microphone, I can allow you to talk. I think the best, maybe the easiest way to do that is to use your raise hand feature, but I don't see that anymore. Is that gone? I probably can't raise my hand because I'm the host. Well, let me ask you. There's few enough of us on the line today. Are your organizations already tobacco free? Anybody want to just I don't know, raise your hand or chat in if you guys are already tobacco free, and how do you think that's going? Yeah, Penny, let me bring my mouse over and I'll unmute your line. Yeah, go ahead. Oh.
Hi, so yeah, we are in fact, we are tobacco free on our campus. I am finding, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you can.
We're finding, my office window happens to point out at the front parking lot, and I see patients standing right in front of my window smoking that last smoke before they go inside, and we're supposed to be a tobacco-free campus. Part of the problem is there has been an ashtray for people to put out their cigarette before they walk in, so people think that's become a place to smoke.
Mm-hmm.
The issue that I'm seeing is that right now with COVID, people are already having a hard time with wearing masks. We've had people get violent with us about masks. We don't really have a security team. So we would have to call the sheriff's department. We're a small town, and the sheriff is not very supportive of anything but guns, basically gun rights. And so if we call the sheriff's department for people refusing to stop smoking or for not wearing a mask, we're not going to get any support. So I guess I would ask you how, in a time of increased, even more increased stress that we have on our clients and our employees with the COVID thing, is this the best time to be doing it? I understand we can do some footwork to get it started, but I guess that's behaviorally, it's difficult to ask change when you are already super stressed. So I just ask you for some input on that.
Yeah, and I don't know if Chad's has maybe some additional input on this, but you're right. This is a particularly tricky time. But when we deal with smoking cessation with individuals, one of the number one reasons people smoke is what they tell us, right? Is stress. Number one reasons people relapse is stress. And people will say, well, when I'm less stressed, I'll quit. I'll quit then. But right now, I don't feel like I'm in enough control of my life. And that's a legitimate concern. But at the same time, there's never going to be no stress, right? And especially among the clients that most need our support in regard to tobacco use. Their lives are just precarious in a lot of ways. And so we just simply can't wait for them to get their quote unquote stress under control before we engage in this tobacco cessation attempt. And then we also need to, educate them that in fact, using the tobacco undermines their ability to get their stress under control. Like it's a financial strain, and we won't go into tobacco cessation, but the way that these interplay is really important. And so we just need to make sure that we're not. COVID is a big stressor, and we can say, well, when COVID is gone, then I'll handle smoking again, or I'll tackle it again. But do we remember what January and February looked like? The Australian wildfires were happening, and our favorite movie stars were dying, and January seemed pretty stressful to me. In retrospect, maybe not as stressful as March and April were, but still pretty bad. I understand that temperatures are high, and the mask thing has gotten to be really ideological and very weird. So it's hard for me to want to I don't want to necessarily make any comments on the mask, but I would have suggested to the CDC, if they had bothered to write me and ask, that they always should have been talking about masks in terms of that the mask is for other people, right? It's not for those people. It's not for the person wearing it. Because that is the strategy I've seen work the best in public health communications, is really because it's public health, and the idea of the public is sufficiently abstract that people aren't really motivated by it, but they can be motivated to care about the person right across from them, right? Or the person that can see them, or their own specific, family members or friends or whatever. And so I would just go to that with the smoking. And so the first thing I would say is, since you can see them out your window, like they're too close. They shouldn't be visible, just for the triggering elements. And then we can cage it all in the sort of empathetic framework is how I would approach it. It's unfortunate that you can't get sheriff support for anything like this, but at the same time, I don't know that I would rush to recommend that being a strategy anyway. It's not always the best idea to bring law enforcement into our substance abuse facilities. Chad, did you want to add anything to my comments there?
Sure. Can you hear me, Jim?
Yes, we can.
The one thing, you brought this up, Jim, but regardless of, the current stressors, there's just some, and Jim spoke to this a bit, but just kind of assessing what's not working with your current policy, which is, if you have, and this is really, really common with receptacles for cigarettes and putting those in front of the entrances, the front entrances, or where you can see them. And just, if you have a campus policy, essentially those shouldn't be on your campus. You're really signaling that it's okay to smoke until you enter the door. And so, I think there's just some things you can do in revisiting your, doing an environmental scan of regarding your policy and what's working, what's not. And I don't think that reflects on, wearing masks or not wearing masks or whatnot. The other thing I would say is that a lot of agencies are really looking at this pandemic time as a time when they can retool their, reassess and retool their policies. And it's because, there's a lot of flux in how many people are at their agencies, how many people are working from home. And so actually you could reframe this quite a bit on looking at both from a community standpoint, how peers can support peers in their health by not smoking in this time of pandemic, but also that this is just an ideal time to revisit policies like this in general.
Excellent questions, Penny. There's no easy solutions. The questions are way easier to ask, but I'm glad that you did it anyway. It does take time, and just constantly keep the pressure on, and we can push the habit down. We have about 1 more minute if we wanted to try to get in another question. All right, well then, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. I'll give you back 1 more minute of your afternoon, and we'll see each other for the learning community call. What's the date on that, Chad? September 14th, something like that?
Yes, the 14th.
Thanks.